he joined the Stampa in 1995, where he edited business pages before becoming director of the EU desk in Brussels in 2006. And Marco is a prolific writer. He's got more than 10 books published on various topics, including history, economy, and EU affairs. Both gentlemen will speak for some time, and then we'll take some questions. So perhaps, Per, begin with you, and your views on the future narrative for Europe.
That's right. First, thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you to the people right here. I hope you're not going to do I made the possible mistake of delivering a couple of notes so the translators the hope of easing their job. And of course the problem is, am I going to follow my own notes? And if not, will I confuse them too much? We shall see. I know, as a matter of fact, very little about the ways of Europe, including how to handle the I came here quite a lot in the 60s and 70s, mostly writing about NATO. And of course, I was aware of the EU beginning. And the idea of this ever-uniting Europe, ever deeper Europe, fascinated me, also in a positive way. But the necessary apparatus behind the idea did not interest me very much in those days. But Europe as such became a plank in my books and in my other journalistic work, even and sometimes, especially when I covered the Balkan Wars, where one of the persistent weaknesses of the EU sprang into the eye, that of a missing defense capability. And this is again, of course, painfully obvious these days with events in Ukraine, in Syria, Turkey, Afghanistan, etc. We are talking about sometimes the soft power of Europe. That's very, very important, the soft power. But you cannot project soft power if you do not have a hard fundament to it. That is military power. Anyway, great was my surprise and also my pleasure as I was asked in early 2013 to join the so-called Cultural Committee, which had as its purpose to work on a new narrative for Europe. And as Karen so said, narrative. This is the first word by which we frighten the Europeans. On top of it, in my estimation, the work on that narrative, although intense, failed. The narrative was, as some of you may realize, it was published earlier in the year, and hardly anybody took any notice of it. And maybe some of us who sat on that committee should be quite glad that it was so. I thought the narrative as it appeared was badly written and badly thought through. This had many reasons. One reason was a rather chaotic, I dare say, leadership within the committee, and also it had to do with the fact that the committee, as it was composed, reflected another EU weakness. There were almost no East and Central European voices in the committee. To give you an example, we had 3 colleagues from the French theater alone. And we had 3 so-called East Europeans all in all. I mean, that is not a way of trying to formulate a tale, a story, an adventure on what Europe is. The first point I make there, the lack of leadership, has to do, I think, with an understandable fact that the Commission, Barroso Commission, did not want to sit on the committee. The committee was given total freedom. And that in itself, of course, is fine. Except the fine idea turned out to create chaos. We were sitting there, probably about 20 talking heads, and we didn't really know where to go. I think we would have been much better off with 2 or 3 writers or intellectuals or whatever you call them, plus a representative or 2 from the Commission to lead and to guide. But now we were sitting there, mostly artists. By far the large majority were artists. Also maybe reflecting a kind of attitude within the Commission. And artists may be good at producing theater, at singing, at dancing, at painting, at doing sculptures, but they are not necessarily good at formulating thoughts about what Europe is and what Europe should become. They may be very good Europeans themselves. This is not what I'm in no doubt about that here. But they cannot, individuals as they are, highly individualistic, they cannot necessarily compose a readable and engaging paper. So there, I think we are touching upon a weakness, a basic weakness in the construction of the EU apparatus. One is afraid of being exposed as being highly bureaucratic or dictatorial, even being against hard-won European personal freedoms and all that. So instead of leading, one is maybe reacting. And that brings me to a first conclusion concerning communication between the EU apparatus and the Europeans. We need much more confidence within the EU organizations. We need more courage, and we need much more optimism. The bureaucracy, or the bureaucracy as we sometimes call it, seems to me to be infected by a culture of worries. To accept silently being battered by scaremongers, and by quite a number of national governments, which make a living out of catering for an anti-European sentiment produced by themselves and by press people, commentators like me, though I do not belong in this category, especially now, being critical about the EU, being pessimistic, always talking about a crisis, frightening the people, believing that there is money to be earned in being critical, pessimistic, writing about catastrophes. So I very much hope that the incoming Juncker Commission and the new tough chairman of the Ministerial Council, Donald Tusk, will go onto the attack, will refuse falsehood and loudly promote the EU for what it is. A motor for peace and welfare, and as such, a monumental success. How do we get this message across? It's not easy, with Brussels behaving sometimes like the rabbit paralyzed in front of a poisonous snake. So what do? First of all, we try to keep the media at arm's length, at least. We play down the immediate worries and stories which are cropping up every day. We ignore the stupidities, and we explain things in their historic perspective. The EU has put an end to 1,500 years of European civil war, culminating in an orgy of blood and destruction of last century, followed now by a peace which has left the vast majority of Europeans enjoying a quality of life unknown to anybody before on this globe. This is no mean achievement. This is, as a matter of fact, the central message on which the people sitting in Brussels, reacting to the press and to other opinions and around the continent, this is the central message on which practically every answer should be built. Sure, there are problems, many problems, serious problems, but they are being remedied by the EU, and they would have been worse without the EU. So our first advice is, and now here I'm already conflicting a little bit with Karen, never use the word crisis. Leave that to irresponsible journalists and opinion makers. There is no crisis. Crisis means that schools, hospitals, public transport, police, and other services disappear. That salaries and pensions are not being paid. That the very state starts dissolving. We are not nearly there. And we will not get there. Thanks to the blessings of the EU general discipline, the internal market, the open borders, etc. So once again, never use within the EU machinery, never use the word crisis. A pet subject of demagogues and populists is the EU bureaucracy. Well, to the best of my knowledge, the Commission employs about 30,000 people. This is the equivalent of the number of public employees in one of about 4 or 5 Danish regions. I mean, it's an interesting figure, right? The demagogues and the populists should be exposed continuously by the EU bureaucracy for what they are. Traitors in fear and prejudice. I speak in Denmark quite regularly. I experience much less criticism and grumbling than one would expect from reading the Danish press, including my own newspaper. The writers of letters to the editor are often, as are also so many commentators, activists, not generalists. They should be treated accordingly. Most people with whom I speak in Denmark and also around in Europe are more or less supportive of the EU. They may consider themselves Danes, Bulgarians, Portuguese or Scots before they consider themselves Europeans. And they may not, necessarily at least, support any further development in the direction of a federal Europe. But mostly they like the chances and they like the openness provided by the EU. Many also realize that the EU, though too feebly, tries to contain local bureaucracies, corruption included, and that other problems such as international crime, drugs, immigration, climate change, and strategic challenges such as the Russian military threat now in the East and the terror that we experience in the Middle East must be fought on a common European level. Which brings me to 3 further points. There is a huge reservoir of European goodwill to be activated, especially in the Baltic states, in Eastern and Central Europe, and in Southeastern Europe. Here we need a hands-on attitude. And as I said, this is here, I think, that the Committee on the New Narrative, on which I sat for a year before leaving it in disgust, failed. The outgoing Commission made a mistake. This is my second point. I dare say, by siding with the central governments in London and Madrid on the issue of independence to the Scots and the Catalans. I am not speaking in favor nor against these 2 issues. This is completely separate from what I want to say. The EU is supposed to defend the peoples of Europe, not the states of Europe. The long-term goal, I suppose, is a federation of the Europeans, for the Europeans, and legalized by the Europeans, not a federation of so-called sovereign states. In other words, we need to move away from that recent and historically seen quite catastrophic invention called the national states, towards a more natural and sensible cooperation between strong cities and strong regions, led by Brussels, not ruled by Brussels. This again could be a core message for any new story about what Europe really is about. Europe is for the Europeans, not for the politicians. And then I have a third point, which is we must strengthen the image of the EU by being the defender, as I said, of the people. To do that, we also need a tougher line on member states such as Hungary, Romania, Spain, France, and Great Britain, etc., which go on violating the European spirit of openness and ever-deepening union. We need a tougher line against would-be member states such as Montenegro and Azerbaijan, currently heading, quite incredibly, the European Council, both of which habitually violate freedom of expression and other human and European rights. So please, more politics, more perspective, more freedoms, an activist line, not a defensive line. As my old friend Policzek Geremik, who was in those days Polish foreign minister, later MEP and a great European, and now sadly dead, once said to me, "We have forgotten the language of beauty." Remember this, the language of beauty. Let us not be terrified by the professional worry makers. Let us not discuss on their premises, which we do all too often. Let us discuss Europe on our premises. Europe as an ideal, the Europe of thinkers and workers, the Europe of culture, of revolutions, and of liberty, the Europe of village churches, cathedrals, and temples, Europe of peace and prosperity, Europe as our common fate, Europe as a beauty. The Juncker Commission should stay calm, do solid work, and express itself in a human, understandable, beautiful language. Believing that history is on its side, knowing that the EU has done very well, that peoples and countries are lining up to become members. We in this room belong to the first European generation ever, which do not have to fear war between the Europeans. This is a great and wonderful accomplishment. So, in the next few years, the EU should try to move away from its present defensive position onto the high ground and engage more clearly, more convinced with the Europeans directly, forgetting about the worry-mongers, forgetting about the recalcitrant national governments. In short, to end, a few lead words: optimism, confidence, courage, direction, beauty. Thank you.